So what you're about to watch is some commentary on Karlo Broussard and Todd Friel of Wretched Radio, because they're all talking about the same thing, about the Pope's authority to speak on Christian and moral issues. So there is some lighthearted mockery in here on my part against Karlo Broussard. I just want to be clear that that mockery is meant humorously and as an honest recommendation for him to practice his apologetics. Alright, so this video has two potential titles. The main title is that this is a message for Todd Friel and Steve Larson. But there is another title. Karlo Broussard sucks at apologetics. If you don't know who Karlo Broussard is, he does apologetics for Catholic answers. Now, every apologist on there has a slightly different perspective, and they don't all agree with each other. So I'm not here to throw stones at anyone. And recently he had to defend the Pope, and he just did a terrible job. So I'm going to play his response. I'm not going to play the question. I'm going to play his response, and then I'm going to play, after a little bit of commentary, a little piece of Todd Friel, or whatever the guy's name is, speaking against the Pope, because they make some assumptions that are just not true. And while I am Catholic, I'm not going to answer this in a Catholic perspective. I'm actually going to answer it in a historical perspective. The reason for that will become quite obvious and quite clear. To the accusation that the Pope is not the head of the Church and should not have sway or power to influence Catholics in the United States, because by doing so he's actually influencing American policy, and Protestants reject the Pope as, the guy says, as the white Pope, but technically I think he means the black Pope, which would be the Antichrist. The first thing that Karlo doesn't spend enough time refuting is the concept that Catholics worship the Pope. We don't worship the Pope. So that's number one. Number two, the idea that the Pope is the head of the Catholic Church, which is the head of the Christian Church. We'll get into that when we get into the Todd Friel, the wretched stuff. But the caller's main objection, though, was not to the Pope, but to the fact that the Pope objects to the death penalty, which I've talked about that in other videos with Orthodox Catholics. And for those that don't know, Orthodox Catholic is Eastern Orthodox Christian. And I've also talked about this with Bad Tempered Badger. And that's an atheist and a badger and a furry. I think he's a furry. But anyway, the Catholic dirty wars, I don't know what that is. Honestly, I'm going to tell you that right now. Apparently, 30 years ago, there was a thing called the Catholic dirty wars. Anyone want to tell me what that is? Give it in the description down below. So, here's an example of Karlo Broussard's horrible apologetics. Enjoy.
Well, George, that's quite a bit there. That's a mouthful, my friend. First of all, I would just clarify for our listeners' sake out there, Si, that we don't worship the Pope. He is simply a successor to St. Peter, a human being and a sinner, just like all of us.
For those that don't know what a successor is, originally there were 12 apostles. Each one of those apostles had disciples. Of those disciples, there were 70, sometimes 77, depending on how you do the math and who you're counting. Of these people, of the 77, they all founded churches. These are the original 70 churches of the Catholic Church. Now, when I say Catholic, I'm not talking about the Roman pontificate. We'll get into that in a second. We're talking about the patriarchs. These patriarchs are direct apostolic successors from the first 12 apostles. Okay? Now, these are called the Church Fathers. The Church Fathers are the people who founded the religion and are the ones who wrote the things that we consider Christianity to be. They came up with the terminology for the concepts that we believe, such as the Trinity, such as communion, such as confession, such as the term apostolic. All of these things come from them. So Christmas, Easter, the words that we're using when we use those words come from these people called the Church Fathers. They founded all the original churches. These are the churches that Paul was writing to in his epistles. Okay, so you see where this is going. Now, of these, each one had a patriarch. These patriarchs were originally 12. Okay, drum roll please. 12. These patriarchs each had a special church. Peter technically started the one in Antioch, I believe, or maybe in Syria, but in each major community, from Coptic to Greek to Jerusalem, the one Jerusalem still standing, by the way, had its own patriarchy. These patriarchs were the ones who were in charge of their specific section of the church. And each one of these had slightly different traditions, but they all agreed on certain universal truths. Why is that important? Because universal is what Catholic means. It also means the whole truth. So these universal truths are where we get the term Catholic. Okay? Now, after the Great Schism and after the Muslims invaded and conquered Jerusalem, Turkey, Greece, many of the churches of the original patriarchies were destroyed, leaving only about 6 or 7 rites or churches still in existence. That did not happen in the West. On the other hand, in the West, the few extra churches that existed end up being assimilated into the Roman Catholic, which was still called a patriarchy. And it was called a patriarchy for a very long time because he is the apostolic successor of Peter. There are other apostolic successors. These are the patriarchs, such as the Patriarch of Russia, the Patriarch of Constantinople, the Patriarch of Jerusalem. Now, after the schism, Patriarch of Rome went from being a patriarch to now being the Pope. Pope is just a colloquial term that means father, which is what the Italians and the French called, and the German as well, the Germans before they became Protestant, by the way, called the Patriarch of Rome. You see? So, that's where that's coming from. But let's continue.
And he possesses a particular position of authority to guide and shepherd the flock of God on earth.
But basically, the Pope was just the patriarch with the highest position of honor, that is the seat of Peter, because Peter was handed the keys of the kingdom. That's all that was, the first among equals. Now that the Roman Catholic Church was the only church really standing or powerful, while the Eastern Church or the Eastern Rite was under the grips of Islamic control, where they were being suppressed, outside of the Oriental and the Coptic, what ended up happening is that the Pope went from being the first among equals to having primacy, because his was the only free voice to speak. All right, so what happened? Well, the Roman Catholic Church made the bishops, that is the magisterium, have authority with the Pope, which meant that the Orthodox Church that had been suppressed by Muslim conquerors and didn't have a way to publicly enforce their dogma or their dictates lost some authority in the West. That authority will again be challenged with the Protestant Reformation, but that's a totally different story. So let's continue on.
A successor to St. Peter, a human being and a sinner, just like all of us. And he possesses a particular position of authority to guide and shepherd the flock of God on earth. And there's nothing in that entails that we worship him. So I just wanted to clarify that for our listeners' sake, lest anybody be led astray and confused by that. Now, I'm not going to speak to all of everything that you're laying on the table here, but I will speak, George, to the principle itself that you're bringing up, namely, can the Catholic Church speak on things that apply to societal life?
That was not brought up at all. Karlo Broussard once again does something that frustrates me when Protestant apologists do this, which is he takes the question and then he goes to a slightly related question because he can't answer the main question, which is why I think he's a bad apologist. He doesn't tackle it head on, and he doesn't seem to have the ability to say, I don't know. I'm pretty sure if you look through all the tapes, you can find him saying that. But for the most part, when I've heard him, if he doesn't know what the answer is, he doesn't just say he doesn't know. Instead, he tries to give an answer to a slightly related question that's not the actual question being answered, which bothers me.
Politics. Now, when it comes to the Catholic Church, speaking on things that apply to politics and the life of society, the Catholic Church, remember, George, we believe that the Pope has been entrusted with care of truth. Not only truth that has been revealed to us supernaturally from heaven above through our Lord Jesus himself and through what was revealed to the apostles by the power of the Holy Spirit, but the successor of Peter is also entrusted with the mission of guarding natural truth.
Do you see the mistake he made there? What he said is not incorrect, but do you see the mistake that he made there?
That we can come to know by the natural light of human reason about God, about man, about the relationship between the two, about the world, creation, and how we are to relate to each other and to creation. So the Pope is within his rights as the successor to St. Peter, as guardian of the truth, to speak on issues that pertain to the dignity of the human being. And whenever there are certain things in the life of society that are that contradict or undermine the dignity of the human being, well, then the Pope is within his right to speak out against those things. Now, of course, you brought up capital punishment. And capital punishment...
Okay, before we get into capital punishment, he presented a truth that is objected to and denied by Protestants and by atheists, by the way, as his starting point. And then he went to something that is more acceptable to all parties. He should have started off with the acceptable thing, the thing that all of us agree on, and then taken the step to the thing that we as Catholics personally believe. That way, the leap is less. Instead of going, hey, here's this thing that you all don't agree with. Oh, and then here's this thing that you do. Because now they're not listening.
Is one of those things that belong to the natural order, something, a punishment that can be set forth by those in power who have control of the common good, and that deals with the dignity of the human being. And the Pope, and the recent revision of the catechisms following suit from JP2 and Benedict XVI, is making it a prudential decision that given our historical circumstances, that to employ capital punishment is viewed as contradicting the dignity of the human being. Not the act in and of itself, but given historical circumstances, it is seen as such. The Pope is within his right to make such, to give such teachings, to make such decisions, because we are dealing here with something that belongs to what he is privy to, given the successor of Peter, namely the truth about the dignity of the human being and how we are to relate to each other as human beings. So this belongs within the realm of natural truth. I mean, one could even argue it's in divine revelation as well, because we find it in the Old Testament and the New Testament, with the state having the authority to implement capital punishment.
Did you hear him talk against himself right there? Because I did. Okay, so there's a much easier answer to this, which is the answer I gave, like I said, to Joey from All the Stars Are Dead, and the same answer I gave to Bad Tempered Badger in our debates on Catholicism and religion, which is very simple. Jesus was executed as a criminal of the state. Jesus pardoned the thief behind him. Remember, there were two people executed behind him. Pardoned one of them, regardless of whatever the crime was. Pardoned him before death. Jesus preached and spoke forgiveness, and that only God can judge. Only he can judge and see into man's hearts. No one else has that ability. The argument here is not that governments can't have the death penalty. That's the wrong way to go. The argument here isn't even for human dignity, which is the argument they try to use against abortion. He's just opening one can of worms after another. The argument here is, what do you think Jesus would say about the death penalty and the way it's used today, and how innocent people are constantly being executed, as we can find out through DNA record? That's the question to ask, and that's the one that makes your point in this kind of conversation, which is, what would Jesus do given the circumstances we currently find ourselves in? Not, has execution ever been justified? That's the wrong approach.
Pope is not stepping over boundaries to deal with things that he shouldn't be dealing with, because these are natural truths that belong, that have to do with the dignity of the human being, and that falls under the umbrella of things that the Pope can pontificate on.
The caller's next objection is actually one that I touched on earlier, which is that he thinks that the Catholic Church, and specifically the Pope, shouldn't have say over the governance of America. Which is fine, he can say that, but then you're going to have to talk to atheists who say that the Bible shouldn't have any sway over the Constitution or over the laws of America. And then you have to talk to the Buddhists and the Muslims who want their holy books to also be acknowledged in the Constitution and in the laws. So you can't have it both ways, because if you're going to say, well, the Bible is part of the founding of the Constitution, which, by the way, I do believe that the Bible influenced the Constitution, just as I believe Plato's Republic influenced the Constitution, just as I believe Aristotle's Politics influenced the Constitution, just as I believe the Lycurgus reforms. In the Peloponnesian War, if you read it, there's a very famous speech about governance and about the state that also influenced the United States Constitution, also the Constitution of Rome, and also the Magna Carta. All of these influenced the Constitution of the United States. How do we know this? Because the people who wrote the Constitution and passed laws and made the first amendments and did all of that all kept diaries, and they mention these books as influencing them. That's how we know that these books influenced them. So yes, the Bible did influence the Constitution, but so did some other things, such as Plato's Republic, Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War. So yeah, it did. For any atheists out there who's trying to say it didn't, they're wrong. It did. But if we simply make the democracy a theocracy, then you're going to get into a whole other can of worms where, okay, well then how come we're not going to use the Old Testament Jewish laws? Or how come we're not going to apply the Quranic Islamic laws, Sharia? How come we're not going to apply Buddhist laws, Confucian laws? Confucius has very great laws. China's one of the most powerful countries in the world. Trust me, Confucianism works. So you got to start asking yourself, well, which holy book are we going to take influence from if we're only going to pick one? Or we can do the method we currently use, which is we are a majority Christian nation. Our laws are influenced by our beliefs, and our beliefs are influenced by our holy books. So our laws reflect Christian ideals and have been influenced by Christian ideals, but those are not the only ideals on the table that can be debated and voted on, as it reflects in our legal system, not our religious system. See? Then the caller states that he would like to make a draconian law that says Catholics cannot vote or take part in American politics. Which, yay, a psycho, great, a bigot, and a nut bar. And Karlo Broussard still will not be able to hit this one out of the park. Now, I want you to listen as Cyril, who's the host, but technically really the co-host on all these shows, he is going to play cleanup where Karlo drops the ball. And he does a wonderful job of cleaning up Karlo's horrible mess. Please listen.
I want to continue our conversation, George. We only have a limited amount of time. Are you? You said that it's not, the Pope shouldn't be allowed to influence our laws or to make laws in America. That is the current state of things, I believe. I don't believe the Pope is exercising any authority.
Now, I could say a few things about the way that Karlo is about to respond, but I'm a Christian and he's a Christian, and I'm a Catholic and he's a Catholic, so I'm not. But enjoy this listen.
Unfortunately, I'm sorry that you feel that way about Pope Francis, to say such a thing, that he should be executed, if I'm hearing you correctly. But George, listen, here's the principle. I understand you're a Protestant, and obviously you don't accept Pope Francis being the successor to St. Peter, who has the governing authority for the flock of God here on earth, and that he's the universal shepherd. I get that. But from the Catholic perspective, George...
Do you see the mistake he made there again? He's talking to a Protestant, and he's saying that the Pope has universal authority. When we Catholics, speak to Eastern Orthodox Catholics, we don't come at them with, by the way, we have the Pope, so listen to us. We don't do that. So why would you do that to a Protestant that's clearly hostile to not only the papacy, but to Catholics individually?
Is the successor to St. Peter, given an authority by Christ to guide and lead his church.
And he doesn't mention the other successors to the other apostles.
Be a custodian of the truth of God, well then he would have authority to pontificate on matters that deal with the truth and the dignity of the human being. Sure, he is not to pontificate and influence laws within the life of society that go beyond the boundaries that he is privy to, such things as the dignity of the human being. If that goes, of how we're going to do economics this way and that way or whatever, that's something that goes beyond what his authority extends to. But when we're talking about capital punishment, when we're talking about the dignity of the human being, as I said, these are truths that fall under the umbrella that his authority extends to, that he can pontificate on.
All right, and now here's the cleanup at the end. Here's the post-mortem on this.
Able to have a reasonable conversation, but among the things was that he felt that there was a choice between worshiping God and worshiping the Pope,
right,
and also that the Pope should be executed. Those were...
Just to be clear, Jesus Christ is the head of the church, and the church is one singular body. So, I have not heard what Karlo Broussard says at the end of this, because the other part was so bad I had to make this video. So, if Karlo Broussard does not say the words, Jesus is the head of the church, not the Pope, and that Catholics don't worship the Pope is simply the mouthpiece of the church, if he doesn't say that, well, you know why they need a new apologist on the team.
Well, I just wanted to address what he left off right at the end there, that we either have to worship God or the Pope. Once again, he's making this false assumption that within Catholic doctrine we believe we have to worship the Pope, and that is a false assumption, okay? We do not worship the Pope. We only worship God, and anybody who's worshiping any finite being needs to repent and direct his or her adoration and worship to God alone, who is worthy of adoration and worship. And then I just wanted to say, Sai, it's important for our listeners to know that, even within Pope Francis's recent decision of revising the catechism concerning the death penalty, it's a prudential judgment here, and Catholics can disagree about whether or not this is a good prudential judgment. Some Catholics will say it is, other Catholics will say it's not. They prefer the older precept, right? The older law of coming from JP2. And Catholics are free. Now, if there is disagreement and we're debating this, we must do it with respect, right? We have to respect the Holy Father in his office. But at the same time, one can have question about whether or not this was the best prudential judgment. But nevertheless, we need to have respect to the Holy Father in his office with his judgment.
Oh, are you satisfied with that cleanup? I wasn't satisfied with that post-mortem. But the post-mortem done by Karlo, as they don't always do post-mortems, so usually that's done when the apologist just couldn't handle the guest. Happens more often than you think. So they let the apologist speak without the caller in able to respond back. And still, Karlo can't hit it out of the park. I am saying he needs to work on his apologetic skills. But wait, there's more.
Talking about the local church and who has authority over it. And you might think, well, this is kind of diminishing the role of the pastor. Ultimately, this will enhance your understanding of what that fellow does every single day, and it will become more awesome when we rightly answer the question, who is the authority of the church?
Again, Jesus Christ. That's the authority of the church. If they say anything else, they're just wrong. By the way, Todd Friel, I don't agree with almost anything he says. I think he's a real jerk. I think he's kind of slimy. I think he's kind of a creep. But hot dog it, can he perform? He is interesting. If you ever seen him do his open air preaching, he's really fast on his feet. You see him do his show. He's a great host. He's a great speaker. So luckily, being kind of slimy and being kind of creepy is not a disqualifier for being a good Christian. I just want to say that. Yes, he comes off as a salesman. Yes, he comes off as an entertainer. Yes, he comes off as a bit aggressive. But none of those things disqualify you from being a good person or from believing in Christ. Thank God for that.
This matter of the headship of the church is not an incidental matter. It is a fundamental matter. It is not peripheral, it is primary. It is not secondary, it is supreme. No pope is the head of the church.
It's like they're just talking to a wall and they're hearing their echo and they're like, yep, I said it.
No hierarchy of cardinals and bishops is the head of the church. No pastor is the head of the church. You are not the head of the church. I am not the head of the church. No elder board is head of the church. No congregational vote is the head of the church. No seminary president is the head of the church. No denominational president is the head of the church. There is but one head of the church, and he is the one who is seated at the right hand of God the Father, who with the shedding of his own blood has purchased the church for himself.
In other words, not even John MacArthur is the head of the church.
If you open up the catechism of the Catholic Church says the exact same thing. He's not making a point. Karlo Broussard is not making a point. Steve Larson, you're an idiot. Todd Friel, you're a little creepy. Karlo Broussard, you really need to work on your debating skills. That being said, I am Catholic. I do believe in God. I do believe in Jesus Christ. I do believe in the Trinity. I do believe the Pope has apostolic authority through apostolic succession. I do believe there are other patriarchs that also have apostolic authority through apostolic succession, and I do believe the bishops have apostolic authority through apostolic succession, and I don't think that makes them better people, because clearly even people who are considered priests and bishops and popes can sin and make mistakes. That's not what apostolic succession is about. This tradition has been passed on directly from the beginning, from Jesus directly, and this is the clearest line to know what actually was said and done by Jesus, because there's plenty that Jesus did that is not in the Gospels. For one thing, the Gospels were written after Jesus died in a different language than Jesus spoke. For another, the people who were around Jesus and saw Jesus lived after he died, and they had stories to tell. Not all of them were correct. Not all of them were theologically sound, but they had stories to tell. And as these stories evolved and other people with religious aspirations had ideas to include, you had more and more texts and gospels be created. And that's why even the Bible, which we believe is important and has an authoritative foundation to our faith, is not the only foundation to our faith. It's why we have tradition, so that way the two can guide each other. But anyway, I'm Catholic.